Is Batman a Boy Scout type hero? Many people refer to him as an anti-hero, which makes other Batman enthusiasts skin crawl because they see nothing anti-heroic about him, and to this day Batman remains one of the most debated heroes ever conceived and has a crap ton of highly contrasting iterations, which sort of speaks to this point of him being a very interpretable hero. I made a video about traditionally heroic characters like Superman and Captain America, which this video assumes you've watched, but if you haven't, the long and short of it is that these classical heroes that are associated with all of these traditional, steadfast masculine values like being good, kind, generous, non-vindictive, responsible, and fairly static, especially from a moral perspective throughout the story, are largely misunderstood, considered lame, and thus have fallen out of style in favor of darker, edgier anti-heroes, and that the main fault lies in the writers and directors' inability to aptly portray the more interesting parts of these characters rather than always focusing on the fist fighting, the spectacle, the bombastic stakes, the easy stuff. Also the stuff that increasingly less people care about because every single movie nowadays bombards us with these elements to the point where we're desensitized to them. It also doesn't help that modern values, culture, content, and advice on the internet have all shifted towards equating kindness, especially male kindness, to weakness. Some degree of aggression is preferred, even if it borders on the unhealthy or the self-sabotaging. Nice guys finish last, kind guys are boring, and the highly driven, cold, calculated, aloof boyos are where it's at, which is indeed where a lot of it is at, but this kind of glorification also allows various psychopathic pretenders to hijack the game and grab all the attention. There is something to be said about the correlation between nice guys and weak guys, because weak guys can only be nice, or feign being nice at least, since they have no agency. But the problem with that is that it throws under the bus people who are both nice and strong, who have power but choose to be charitable. In other words, the Boy Scout hero. Thus, great care and effort must be taken to differentiate between the two, lest we sacrifice one of the most important archetypes of masculinity that we have, but I'm slipping into tangents. So you have these two camps. On one side, you have the unwavering Boy Scouts, and on the other, the cool, edgy, scarred, and then redeemed anti-heroes and darker heroes that speak to our own imperfections, faults, and fuck-ups and help us move past them. But which one is Batman? The man known as both the Caped Crusader and the Dark Knight, which alludes to both of these categories. And while the knee-jerk opinion is that he's an anti-hero because he wears black, and the connoisseur opinion is that he's actually the superhero that cares about life the most and is thus a Boy Scout, the truth is that he's actually a bit of a hybrid. Now don't get me wrong, he's not an anti-hero, that much is clear. An anti-hero is a protagonist that lacks conventional hero qualities but still ends up saving the day or resolving the story, just not out of a desire for heroism, but rather for different, often selfish reasons that just happen to coincide with the greater good. That couldn't be further from Batman. So Batman has the trappings of a creature of the night, but he's actually just a heroic dude trying to do good. We know this. And when I first thought about this, I was like, yeah, case closed. But after thinking about it for an extra 2 seconds, I went, you know what, actually, And that is the rest of this video. Or it's more of a Some stories feature regular people that go through the hero's journey. They may go on an adventure, or they're called to serve, they stumble, they fall, fail, but get up again. Sometimes they're selfish, their heart isn't in the right place, and by the end they get transformed into the hero. Other stories feature Boy Scouts, as I call them, who are more or less heroic from the start, and the plot revolves around trying to maintain that heroism till the end of the story. Now, that doesn't mean that a hero's journey dude can't ever be categorized as a Boy Scout. In fact, many protagonists who go through heroes' journeys come out the other side as Boy Scouts. Spider-Man is a good example. He made a mistake early on, his uncle died because of it, and that turned him into a hero that then exudes practically all the qualities of the Boy Scout. He doesn't crack, doesn't kill, he doesn't exhibit anything anti-heroic. In fact, Spider-Man's probably a better Boy Scout exploration than most Superman stuff, because of things like the Venom arc, or at least the way it's done in the animated series. It's exactly the thing I keep yapping about. Tempt the hero, bring him close to corruption, but not enough to turn him into Injustice Superman. Just enough to raise the stakes and the adrenaline level and allow a more in-depth exploration of the Spider-Man character and what makes him tick. So while the hero's journey does tend to be absent from pure Boy Scout stories, the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Many characters that go through heroes' journeys end up as Boy Scouts just like Spider-Man. To go back to my initial Luke Skywalker example from the first video, Luke starts out as a bratty, impatient, impulsive, impressionable kid who talks back to his teachers and has delusions of grandeur, but by the time we get to episode 6, he's gotten rid of most of those traits and became a full-blown Boy Scout. In fact, you could say that the whole point of episode 6, and in particular of the throne room sequence, is to complete Luke Skywalker's transformation into a Boy Scout hero. Of course, those scenes also complete Anakin's arc and transform him as well. It does multiple things at the same time, as do many scenes conceptualized by George Lucas. But this is one of the most important points of this climax. Luke refuses, even in the den of ultimate evil with his life on the line while a giant space battle is happening around him and the fate of the galaxy is at stake, Luke Skywalker refuses to cross that line and kill his father. In that exact moment, his transformation into a Boy Scout was completed. As a side note to my side note, this is why the Jedi from the prequel trilogy are often accused of having barely any characterization. It's not that they have no characterization, it's that they're static heroes. They're the good guys, they start out as the good guys and still end up as the good guys, so they more or less try to be Boy Scouts, which, again, makes them seem a bit boring or bland or samey. I say try to be because something happens at that middle point to them and to the Jedi Order as a whole. Some degree of corruption and ignorance sets in that taints the Jedi and prevents them from fulfilling their roles properly. So it's a Boy Scout arc that has this huge stain in the middle, a U-graph that dips dramatically and needs to be redeemed. It's a very fascinating segue that we don't have time for. Anyway, triple side note, I know there are versions of Batman that are more chipper than others, and that other versions kill, and some are borderline psychopathic, and that there's an Adam West Batman and the great schism that came with the Burton Renaissance, so to make it clear to those of you who would rather read the 451st Batman comic instead of having sex for the first time, just know that I'm referring to the mean average of Batmans, the distillation of the most commonly accepted versions of the character. So this is a nuanced issue. Technically, Batman is indeed a Boy Scout, but his entire strategy relies on not letting his enemies know that.
You tried to kill Aquaman. Why?
Gee, why would a hired gun try to shoot somebody?
I'll take it from here. Let me give you one word of advice.
Okay, I'll tell.
What did he say?
You don't want to know.
I can't believe I was ever that green. This is how you interrogate someone.
And we've got 9,453 active jokers organized into about 200 smaller groups. And that's everything I know.
He's a Boy Scout who flirts with fear, blackmail, excessive force. His whole way of superheroing relies on this one bluff, on wearing all the trappings of a dangerous, unhinged wildcard of a vigilante without actually being one. It's honestly quite fascinating. That flirtation with the dark side, that at least willingness to entertain these really sinister thoughts and exercises in blackmail really brings the Boy Scout thing into question and is one of the things that makes this character infinitely fascinating. Batman is a hybrid archetype. Because like it or not, even if you don't follow through with most of these threats, the willingness to present those cards at all sends you almost uncomfortably deep down the dark rabbit hole of moral ambiguity. I mean, can you imagine Captain America blackmailing an enemy by casually revealing he has intimate knowledge of their daughter's whereabouts, implying he could kidnap her and use her for leverage at any time? Or Superman threatening a scientist to cut his funding and leave him and his entire innocent staff out of a job if he doesn't stop his criminal activities on the side? No, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't know to do that, they wouldn't think to do that, they wouldn't have the means to do it, because they're not the head of a giant corporation that has its fingers in every single corporate cookie jar, so it's a tactic born of desperation and an advantage that only Batman has. Because he grew up a powerless, frail mortal in a city that does not respect the rules, and that drove him to push the hero envelope further than his peers, even if he risks pushing it a little too far. Another thing that reinforces this point of Batman flirting with the dark side a bit more than his counterpart is that, believe it or not, the Man of Steel, for all his power, ends up causing way less damage, destruction, and pain than the Dark Knight, ironically. Think about it. Superman, in spite of his power, or rather because of his power, doesn't really hurt anyone most of the time. He can't afford to. He would flick your nose through the back of your skull. And more to the point, he doesn't need to in most cases, because as soon as the overwhelming majority of thugs and criminals see him, it's game over, man! They just drop their weapons, their pants, bend over, ready to take it like champs. Whereas Batman needs to harm people, sometimes severely, particularly in incarnations such as the Arkham games, in which his many takedown moves and cutscenes result in broken limbs, broken ribs, a significant amount of blunt trauma to the head, all probably requiring hospitalization, wheelchairs, assisted feeding through tubes, help going to the bathroom, and a permanent loss of manhood out of sheer shame. And let's not forget, Batman also secretly created contingency plans to take out every single member of the Justice League, his brothers and sisters in arms, without telling anyone, and then those plans were hijacked and used against them. Oopsie. I quite like that one. I mean, it's horrible, but it really shows the full extent of how far down the morally gray rabbit hole Batman is willing to go to accomplish what he believes is necessary. This, not so much darkness, but willingness to be dark and dangerous, also elegantly explains why people tend to be more drawn to Batman than Superman or any other counterpart. Because in the real world, when shit hits the fan, you always want to have a somewhat dangerous man by your side. You want a man who has seen at least some of the ugly parts of life, who's not a spring chicken, who knows how to deal with swindlers, bullies, and criminals, and is willing to stand his ground and take drastic action against them if need be. That often requires delving into a frightfully similar mindset to the thing you're combating. It's like Peterson says, you want a man who's both competent and dangerous. Doesn't mean he should necessarily indulge his dangerousness, but the capacity for it needs to be there.
Very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process, and you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order.
Which, what do you know, that's exactly what Batman does. He flirts with the tools and tactics of a terrifying anti-hero, perhaps even those of a villain, but keeps the noble soul underneath intact. Batman is a Boy Scout. And he isn't. Kind of a 70-30 hybrid split. So a lot of this is theatricality and deception, while some of it is not. Thus, to return to a previous point about how nice guys finish last and bring it full circle, Batman is a nice guy. But based on his near universal popularity, not just currently but throughout all the ages of pop culture, which is exponentially more impressive, he does not finish last. He finishes first right on your fucking face before you even say hello, and then you ask for seconds. That's how much you like him. And the reason is theatricality. Batman has gamed the system whereby he successfully convinced you, me, your mom, the police force, and most notably every villain in Gotham, which was the fucking point, that he is this elemental, larger-than-life edgelord avatar of justice and vengeance, the very personification of it, forced into being by the sheer amount of corruption and injustice concentrated into the cesspool that is Cleveland. Sorry, Gotham. Batman has successfully ennobled guile. Guile, slyness, subterfuge, things that often get a negative connotation, are turned into cool, positive, admirable qualities here. It's a blueprint for how people can integrate naturally darker traits into their lives in a positive way, like tricking a friend into helping themselves, or using rage and anger as motivation to work and build something for yourself rather than screaming at the world and sabotaging those around you, which is exactly what Batman does, and it's a huge part of why people resonate with this character so profoundly. Even in the dating sphere, it's funny how much this whole guile thing is reflected. The world of game and pickup artistry is often seen as a sleazy cesspool of slithery snakes, many a times for good reason, as many men use smoke and mirrors to mask the disappointing lack of substance and or poor intentions that lie underneath, rather than using it as a way to amplify and sell the incontrovertible value that's already there. That second way is the Batman way. Rather rather than using theatricality and deception as a one-off, single-minded way to get into someone's genes, you instead have no such deliberate goal and just wear these trappings as a cloak everywhere you go. They become a second skin that passively attracts people to you without you actively trying, and most importantly, without fooling them about what lies underneath. You have the substance to back it up, just like Batman has the brains, the brawn, the resources, the genius-level intellect, and the virtuousness to back up his persona. It is Guile Ennobled, because after all, with
No guile and no game, there's no girl.
Women understand this much more intuitively than men. The allure, the gestures, the ultra-feminine quirks, the niceties, and most notably the makeup, they're all meant to amplify what's already there, the expectation being that you will eventually like her for who she is, for what's underneath, the intrinsic values that women possess. And before you say it, I know, we have a catfishing epidemic going on, and that these things are increasingly being used more as ways to lie, cheat, and steal, but it used to not be about that. It used to be a much less deceptive exchange. But going back to superheroes and what we can learn from them, everyone needs an in, a way to attract. Women are drawn to Superman because of his power, but stick around because of his moral quality, and they're drawn to Batman because of his mystique, and stick around because of his moral quality. So, in a way, Superman also uses some guile unwittingly. He is power incarnate, an irrefusable temptation for anyone, not just the opposite sex, and a tool without which the virtuous man underneath wouldn't get a fraction of the attention and reverence. Clark Kent's dorky persona proves this. At the same time, power without virtuousness is tyrannical, so both components are necessary. Again, this is why nice guys are considered weak guys, because most of them generally lack the power component, while assholes and oppressive tyrants lack the virtuous side. Bruce Wayne, on the other hand, has everything except raw power. Money, status, tools, intellect, mystique, and theatricality. And it's worth noting that not all of these traits are definitively masculine. Mystique or mystery, for example, are very much feminine in nature. The concealed, the closed off, the hidden. Yet that doesn't mean men can't employ these traits. In fact, this is one of those special cases where combining both types of traits leads to an even more powerful and seductive male figure, much like how glam rockers employed long hair and guy liner to become masculine superstars, or how highly creative, introspective, sensitive men make for the best singer-songwriters, also the best cooks. Since we're directly comparing the two, I mentioned in the previous video that one of the biggest misconceptions about Boy Scouts is that they're one-dimensional good guys who lack any kind of darkness in their hearts and are thus incapable of doing evil, which is simply not true. They are, in fact, always tempted to turn evil. They just do whatever it takes not to. The struggle is what makes them interesting. Portraying that mental battle, finding out what makes them tick, stretching that to its limits, that's the real meat of a Superman or Captain America story. And this is how you know Batman, despite borrowing elements from different archetypes, is ultimately a Boy Scout at heart, because he has the same battle waged inside of him. The question of what would the world do if Batman turned evil is a notion that's often explored in various Batman media, and in fact his no-kill rule often comes from this rationalization that if he starts killing, if he goes down that path, well,
I'll never come back.
Familiar, and it's often posited that if the guy with virtually infinite resources, intimate knowledge about anyone worth knowing, plenty of blackmail material, various contingency plans set up for every single superhero or institution, and with a higher IQ than fucking Einstein, if he goes bad, we're all fucked. So Superman and Batman will both always have that battle waging inside of them, because Batman's constantly tempted to turn evil, and his trauma, that of losing his parents at a young age, is a big part of what keeps him from doing so. It's a trauma that Supes lacks and that works in the Dark Knight's favor and adds a bit of motivation. Superman, on the other hand, has intellectual trauma, if you will. The knowledge that he is the last of his kind and the existential crisis that comes with it, which, although he hasn't seen his parents and his people die, the knowledge weighs on him on an intellectual level. His emotional needs, however, were met by way of his normal farm boy upbringing. He grew up with loving parents, he went to school, he had his first crush, he grew up in a way that Bruce couldn't, because Bruce set himself on a warpath ever since he was 8. Yet Bruce has an overwhelming attachment to humanity and fights tooth and nail to save and ennoble it. This is why Bruce and Clark are one of the best character duos ever invented. They complement each other perfectly. Superman supplements Batman with the emotional stability that he wasn't allowed to have, and Batman inspires Superman to never complain about loss and fight for humanity as if it were his own race. Batman cares deeply about life, once again to the point of refusing to kill in many interpretations. Now, one could argue that this comes more from trauma rather than an intellectual conclusion about morality, but it ultimately doesn't matter where it comes from so long as the effect is the same. It is the moral high ground. Of course, one could also argue that it isn't, since his no-kill rule allows criminals to perpetually escape and cause more evil.
He's a jackass who wrestles with murderers dressed like clowns and throws them in prison so they can break out of prison and then murder more people. Riddle me this. How many people you think Batman's indirectly murdered by being too much of a candy ass not to kill these fools who clearly need to be smoked once and for all, you wrinkly, Shar-Pei-looking dimension-infested fuck?
And while there is some merit to that, after all, the law in some countries and states include the death penalty, I'd argue that it's mostly a problem in the comics and long-running shows where the writers feel compelled to endlessly reuse the same villains because they're the most compelling and most popular. And indeed, in a more believable, organic saga like the Dark Knight trilogy, most villains are only used once. Batman quite literally brings most of them to justice, successfully. Now, of course, most of them end up dying, so that's convenient, but still, even something as alarming as Gotham's corruption and the argument that incarcerating these villains in a system that's so crooked and borderline defunct, even that would be combated by a Bruce Wayne who rather smartly decides to seep his influence into the prisons and the Arkhams, ensuring that at least those institutions remain corruption-free. A truly holistic Dark Knight would use both the Batman side and the Bruce Wayne half to achieve his goals. So ultimately, Batman is either a hybrid archetype or a true Boy Scout with some extra bits on top, depending on where you stand. One could argue he's more of a Boy Scout than the Boy Scouts because, based on how I define the term, temptation is a key component of a Boy Scout-led story, and Batman is beset by temptation at every turn. The temptation to kill, to ally himself with charismatic villains who have a point like Ra's al Ghul, to give up his Dark Crusade or to give into it completely, to use all his power and influence to take control, to become just another tyrant, not to mention all the femme fatales like Poison Ivy, Harley Quinn, and Talia al Ghul, who literally tempt him harder than a bottle of disinfectant tempts a recovering alcoholic. Turns out there are way more Boy Scouts around than we thought, hey? It's kinda like enjoying the same burger for years and only now realizing that it's beyond meat. Let's redefine the Boy Scout term. That is what I want. A toast to the forthright hero. Let's make the term hip and cool and give it the same treatment that the term nerd has gotten, going from lame dork to basically meaning a very knowledgeable, cool person. To that, I'll drink disinfectant. Special thanks to Longthorn and Sir Hrishin for sponsoring the channel.